Hi, friends. All right, we are going to talk today about identifying evidence. The reason we want to start here is partly to prepare you for Unit 4. So at this stage, we're just learning how to kind of spread everything out. We're analyzing, right? So we're taking all the parts of the article and kind of spreading it out so we can look a little bit more closely at these individual parts. So we talked about identifying the main idea. Then we broke down into the major details. So now we are going to look a little bit more closely at evidence. And right now we're just noticing it and identifying it so that when we get into Unit 4, we can start evaluating it. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So when I talk about evidence, some other terms you might hear are minor details. So major details are kind of the bigger picture. Minor details are, the next level down. We might hear words like specific details or specific evidence. And what you're looking for are kind of these minor specifics that often follow and support a major detail. Now, one thing you might notice as we go through some of the articles we'll be working with is that major details, they might be supported by evidence, but sometimes they aren't. So when we get into evaluation, one of the things that you might notice is the author makes a general point, but they don't provide any evidence for it. And that's something that we want to kind of have in mind while we're evaluating. And what we're looking for is very specific information. So things like names, numbers, examples, quotes, things like that are going to fall into the realm of evidence. So let me click out of this for a moment and bring over our urban gardening example from the last lesson. So I think I have up here our notes. Let me open this up a bit more. There we go. We came up with the main idea sentence, something like this. Many cities have promoted urban gardening because of the numerous benefits. So our main idea sentence, we're trying to keep very broad, trying to encompass the entire article. Then we broke it down to what are some of the benefits. Improves access to healthy food. It improves environmental sustainability, brings people together. And then here's the idea about how many cities have promoted urban gardening, right? So we just have these very general ideas here. Now, unfortunately, this example, there's not a whole lot of very specific evidence in here. So some of it's a little, it's a stretch to call it evidence. But when the author here talks about access to healthy food and food scarcity, some of the specifics, many urban areas are considered food deserts where fresh produce is scarce and residents rely on processed foods from convenience stores. So that's like the evidence for this food scarcity bit. By growing fruits and vegetables, right? So this is kind of showing that it gives them access to healthy food. So, we could be more specific by naming specific fruits and vegetables. They do give examples of different ways urban gardening can happen. Okay. So it's not terribly specific, but it's on the right track. Okay. But here, city dwellers can gain access to fresh, nutritious food. That's pretty much saying the same thing as the major detail. So I wouldn't count that as evidence. Urban gardening contributes to environmental sustainability by reducing the carbon footprint associated with transporting produce over long distances. So it promotes environmental sustainability. And here's an example of how it does that. All right. Now, a more specific evidence would be how much it reduces the carbon footprint and that sort of thing. But for this relatively brief passage, this is about what we're going to get for specific evidence. Another way you might think about evidence is, are they just giving one example where they could give others? So are there other ways that urban gardening contributes to environmental sustainability? And there probably are. So the author's giving one example instead of giving like every single example they could think of, right? And it provides social benefits, brings people together. And here are some of the examples. Right, so a little bit of a stretch, but I would call that material evidence because it's giving examples, okay? So I think this one might need to be changed to social benefits. And a lot of times this process is a little bit of back and forth, like I just showed you. Like once I identified the evidence, then I realized that my major detail wasn't quite right. Okay, and then we get down here, and several cities have started large-scale and smaller-scale programs. Increasing major products. Again, we have some of these examples, but I think we've covered those. All right. So here we go. A pilot program in Portland. So when you see capitalized words like this, like a specific city, that's pretty clearly going to be specific evidence. So a pilot program in Portland distributed starter kits with seeds and basic gardening tools to residents. So very specific example. And the two examples we're going to look at are just a few examples of what I'm imagining are many more examples. So the author's just giving us a couple. So this I would count as the specific evidence. And then Chicago neighborhood, this one gets into some of the statistics here, increases by 12%. So that would count as your specific evidence. Okay. So the yellow highlighting that we see here is what you would probably list as your specific evidence. So you're going to do the same thing with your reading 2. You're probably going to spend a little bit more time on that because it's a longer reading, but that's what we're looking for. And let me bring this down. So for now, what you're going to do is, so you should have the APA reference list, you should have the claim, the major details. I was working, well, okay. Like I said, you might need to add or delete rows as needed, so keep that in mind. There might be more than 5 major details in the article, all right? So for each major detail, you would come over here, and if there is evidence provided, write what evidence you see. If there isn't any evidence, I would ask you to write none in there so I know you didn't just skip it. So if I were doing this with the urban, let me see, environmental sustainability. Well, okay, let's do food scarcity, access to healthy food. So if we had that here as our major detail, we don't need the bullet list, then urban areas. So the evidence here would be urban areas equal food deserts, produce. And in all honesty, when I get to the specific stuff, I often just copy and paste. And I might just, I'll take both of them separately. Control C. Come on. Control V. And then this one. Now, if you do copy and paste directly from the article, first of all, you shouldn't be doing that in the left-hand column. These sentences in the left-hand column should be in your words, right? If you are doing it for the evidence part, that's totally fine. But I'm going to turn this nonsense off. This. Okay, there we go. If you copy and paste, I would ask you to at least put the quotation marks in to remind yourself that this is the exact word of the article. All right. And then over in this far right, we're going to say what type of evidence it is. So, again, we don't have a lot of examples of evidence from this brief passage, but it looks like this is a fact. This looks like it's a fact also. Yeah. All right. But we're going to talk about that in the rest of the slideshow. So right now we are just identifying major detail. Copy. And these should be sentences. So another benefit of urban gardening is environmental sustainability. But here we can copy paste. But we're going to put quotation marks. Okay. Makes sense? But again, remember, you're doing this with R2. I'm just showing you the example from the little passage that I used in the last video. Okay, so you would do that. Don't worry about counter argument yet. I'm going to do a whole other lesson on that. So now we're going to talk about types of evidence. So let's get into that. All right, so we did that. Boop, boop. Okay, so you'll see down this right-hand side that after you identify the evidence, I want you to try to determine what type of evidence it is. And there's a couple reasons. Well, I guess the main reason for this is that when we start evaluating the evidence that an author uses, some of these types of evidence are stronger than others, like facts are definitely stronger than hypotheticals. But there's also things that we need to watch out for within each type of, so each type of evidence has like strengths and weaknesses and things to watch for. We'll talk about that closer to Unit 4. Right now, we just want to get practice identifying the types, okay? So let's have a look at the types. All right, so facts are objective and verifiable, meaning that there's no like emotion associated with them, and you can check to see if they're true or not. All right, so an example, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, but it only needs to reach 65 degrees Celsius to boil on Denali, which is biggest mountain in the United States, I think, in Alaska. Statistics. Now, numbers, some people think that anything that's a number is a statistic. Numbers can be facts, and they are facts if they're not going to change, all right? But statistics are collected from data. Usually there's going to be a research or survey or something like that mentioned. They represent patterns, trends, and probabilities, and they could change over time. So if you're looking at a number and you can't tell, well, is this a fact or a statistic? This is how you tell. Statistics could change over time. Facts do not. So an example, according to the CDC, about 42% of U.S. adults are obese. So this number could change over time. Okay, expert testimony. So this might be an opinion, but it's from a qualified specialist. So it's authoritative. On its own, it's not necessarily the strongest evidence, but it can be used to complement other evidence. So here's kind of a long example, but based on my years of research in sleep science, I strongly believe that school start time should be pushed later. Teenagers' brains are wired to function better in the late morning, and early start times set them up for chronic sleep deprivation. Dr. Jane Reynolds, neuroscientist. So, like, if I said this, I think school start time should be pushed later. I mean, that's my opinion, and that's fine. But if this expert who has studied sleep science her whole career says it, it's a little bit more valuable than my opinion, right? Same thing goes with, if you write a paper and I give you my feedback on it and say things that you might need to revise, and then like your mom or your best friend looks at the paper and says it sounds great, I would like to think that my 25 or so years of teaching makes my opinion a little bit more authoritative. No offense to anybody else, but all right. Now, expert testimony, but then this other thing we hear is testimonial. And this is more from like individuals, right? This is from the guy down the street or my great Aunt Sally or something like that. So these are personal accounts. They're a little bit more subjective. They're anecdotal. They show the real world impact, but they're not super strong as evidence. So they add like an emotional tone to a piece of writing, but if that's all we have is personal experience and anecdotes and testimonials, it's not really the strongest evidence. So after using this acne treatment for 2 weeks, my skin cleared up completely. Or student Kirby Mills reports that when he switched to a plant-based diet, he had more energy and felt healthier. So it gives a little personal touch, but not super strong as evidence. All right, a hypothetical is an imagined scenario. And it might help to explain or predict future outcomes, but it's really not super strong as evidence. So it's theoretical, not factual. A lot of times you're going to hear language like, imagine if this, or think about this. Sometimes we'll also see language like if, or would, or could. It's kind of setting up this possibility. So think about the benefits. If every car on the road was electric, carbon emissions from transportation would drop dramatically. Right? So it's not really happening. Okay? There's one article we read, and the author said something, and it was like, that's never going to happen. But he was using it as evidence. And I remember thinking, well, that's never going to happen, so that's not really useful at all. Okay, sorry, I went off on a tangent there. All right, then we have scientific evidence. So any evidence that comes from the scientific method, it could be experiments, it could be observations, could be studies. So studies show that nicotine is highly addictive due to its effect on dopamine levels in the brain. And then we have research studies, and they kind of overlap a little bit, but a research study is probably going to mention the very specific study, whereas this one just says studies show, and it's more general. This one's referring to a specific study. If you have trouble sorting out those two, don't worry about it too much, or don't worry about it at all. A 2022 Harvard study found that students who slept at least 7 hours per night scored 12% higher on cognitive tests. All right, so it's referring to a very specific study. All right, and I think this is my last one, analogy, comparative evidence. And I didn't have this in before, and it's not on the argument breakdown worksheet, but there's other listed on the ABW, so you could use this for other if you wanted to. I included it because the current R2 that I'm using this semester definitely has some of this going on. So we're comparing a known situation to an unknown one to clarify a point. So just as smoking bans improved public health, restricting vaping in public spaces could have similar benefits. So smoking bans is something that readers are familiar with. So this is probably what the author here is arguing for, restricting vaping in public spaces. So they're saying that it's that. I can't find it. Where's my little... I don't know. They're saying that restricting vaping is going to do the same as something people are familiar with, smoking bans. Okay. So what you're going to do now with your ABW is after you've done your major details down here, and then whatever evidence you can find for the major details, over here, I want you to see if you can identify what type of evidence it is. Now, if you're not sure, I would ask that you write, I'm not sure, instead of just skipping it, okay? So I know what you might need help with. And again, this is to help us later on when we're evaluating evidence, because we evaluate all of these different types of evidence differently, right? And there was something else I was going to say about this. Oh, in my face-to-face classes today, some people preferred to go across. So they found the major detail, and they found the evidence, and they identified the type. That's fine. So I just did it the other way because I wanted to explain this, and this, and this separately. All right? So we have one more lesson. It's going to be about counter-arguments. Some of you may be familiar with that. Some of you maybe not. But I'll talk about that in the next lesson. All right. Take care. As always, let me know if you have questions. And talk soon. Bye.